Welcome back. Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has won another term in office following the parliamentary elections over the weekend. Joining me to discuss the political and economic implications are Shihoko Goto, a Northeast Asia associate at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, and Jim Nolt. He has lived in China for several years. He's a senior fellow at the World Policy Institute and joins us from New York. Jim, let me start with you. That one issue that we were talking about, Japan's relationship with China, it has deteriorated under Shinzo Abe. Does it get better now, or does it get even worse?
Well, I think there has been some deterioration, particularly because of the dispute over the islands that the Japanese call Senkaku and the Chinese call Diaoyu. These islands are basically unpopulated, but like so many areas in the world today, there's oil on the sea bottom, there's fishing in the area, and many sea boundaries have not been clearly defined, and that particular sea boundary is now under dispute between China and Japan. It's probably one of the most contentious issues. There's also the issue of history, because many people, not only in Korea, China, and also Southeast Asia, believe that Japan has never really come to terms with its role in World War II, and that the history books in Japan underestimate the role of Japan in aggression and atrocities within those occupied countries during the war. So there are some important issues that are in dispute, and the Chinese always get nervous when the Japanese have a strong prime minister, particularly moving in a nationalistic direction and asserting territorial claims, as Prime Minister Abe is doing.
Shihoko, so here we have a situation where there is a dispute between Japan and China over history, as Jim Nolt pointed out. Natural resources under the seabed, there's no agreement on how those natural resources are going to be divided among the countries of Asia. And you know, we have another point, which is, as Jim pointed out as well, a strong nationalist prime minister. Where does the relationship go to from here?
Well, taking the territorial dispute first. Yeah. At the November APEC meeting, essentially Prime Minister Abe and Xi Jinping more or less agreed to disagree. This has been an issue not just over the last year or two, but it's been an issue since almost 40 years, since the 1970s. It's flared up in recent years for a number of reasons, and there has been concern that it could lead to outright conflict because things happen, mistakes happen in territorial waters when ships come into close contact with one another. My hope is that by establishing better communication between the two countries on this particular issue, that perhaps the worst can be avoided. But again, this is something that remains at the it's a burning concern for not just for Japan and China, but for the world at large. On the history issue, this becomes a much more deeper issue. It's an emotional issue, and I think there is no clear resolution in sight. I think there is a little bit of political manipulation, both by the Chinese as well as the Koreans, to use it as a rallying point, using this concern, real or perceived fear of Japan growing in its military might and its nationalistic, and some would just say it's a patriotic approach that is only allowing Japan to become normal. That aside, the history issue is being taken up by the Koreans from the comfort woman, the sex slave issue during World War II, where many Korean women were forced into prostitution by the Japanese Imperial Army. In China, that's also the case, but also what was very interesting last week, for instance, was that Beijing decided to have its first commemoration of the Nanjing Massacre. Nanjing Massacre, of course, is a very contentious issue because there's a disagreement about exactly how many died. The Chinese say one number, the Japanese say another number. But bringing that commemoration into play really kind of stokes the fire, furthers the flame even more. And I think these are examples of how history can be manipulated by all sides to increase hostility, which has diplomatic as well as economic implications, which does no one any favors.
Jim, given these differences between these two countries, and as Shihoko points out, they're deeply emotional issues as well, how would Beijing be viewing Japan's desire to change the role of its military to create a more positive portrayal of the military, as well as to take away parts of that pacifist constitution?
Well, of course, in general, the Chinese oppose Japan elevating the status of its military or revising its constitution in a way to make use of the military easier, because in the longer run, China fears that Japan might, for example, have a bigger role in defending Taiwan. As the United States draws down in the future its commitments in Asia, perhaps Japan would once again start to assert an interest in Taiwan or in defending Taiwan. And of course, Japan was a colonial power in Taiwan for 50 years. So things like this worry the Chinese government very much. On the other hand, in the short run, we shouldn't be too alarmed, because China and Japan have extensive trade relations, investment relations. They're very important economic partners of each other, and I think both presidents do want to maintain good relations and at the same time continue to assert their claims to what they think is important. So there's really not a kind of return to the bad old days of the 1930s, but rather a continuity of a relationship in which there are some troubling issues, but overall I think the two countries both have an interest in resolving issues peacefully and in not having any radical change in their relationship.
Do you agree, Shihoko, that these two leaders, Xi Jinping and Shinzo Abe, will look past the differences and rather emphasize what is common to these two countries? They met in October, actually. They shook hands. That was a change in itself. So would it get better from there?
My hope is yes, but my expectation is no. We look at, for instance, the economic data. We're already seeing that capital flow investments from Japan to China are decreasing, and they're actually shifting more towards Southeast Asia. Now, there are many reasons for this, but one could actually be that a lot of Japanese businesses are more uncomfortable in committing themselves in the long term to China. The Chinese are not making it easy for Japanese companies to invest further in China. And so you're seeing this impact, this hostility actually impacting trade. Can we see this trend continue if the situation continues as it is now? Yes. We are also seeing on a more grassroots level, are there fewer Chinese students studying in Japan? Yes. Are there fewer Japanese students going to China? Of course. And that kind of thing is something that is very real, and that the two leaders ought to be aware of and should prioritize as something that needs to have a solution to. But it's not really working out as such at the moment.
Jim, next year, Japan commemorates the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. The countries in the region will be looking to see what Japan will be saying, especially China. What can we expect?
Well, I think, you know, this is an important, at least symbolic issue, an emotional issue for many people, because, as I mentioned before, although Germany, for example, nearly all Nazis were purged from government positions, from public life. German people felt a revulsion against the previous regime and the role of the Nazis in World War II. In Japan, there's been more of a continuity at the official level, even though, in fact, as was mentioned, the Japanese public has become much more suspicious of militarism and more peace-oriented in the post-war years. So there may be a little bit of a disconnect between official interest in reviving nationalism and a relatively peace-oriented population. But I think the opportunity really is there if Prime Minister Abe wants to make progress in the relationship, to reach out and to make at least some gestures of admitting that there were horrible things done during the war that are regrettable and that need to be recognized. I think, for example, the Chinese would be less concerned about major celebrations or commemorations of the war if both countries could admit to things that happened and put them behind the way that's been done in Europe more successfully, I think.
Shihoko, what do you think? Very quickly, we have a few seconds left.
It will be a battle for the hearts and minds of not only their domestic audience, but the world in its entirety when World War II is commemorated by all parties concerned. Right now, I think Japan is on the offense, trying to justify itself. What Japan really needs to do is have a consistent message. It is saying that it apologizes and has made reparations for its past crimes and atrocities committed. It needs to stay on message. It cannot waver. It cannot have cabinet members going rogue.
Shihoko, Goto, Jim Nolt, thanks to both of you for joining us. That is all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CCTV America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CCTV America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for